20 years ago, on a night when the storm tore through the valley like something alive, a young man dove into a raging river to save a stranger trapped inside a sinking car. He pulled her free, laid her on the muddy bank, and vanished into the rain before anyone could learn his name. 20 years later, he is a quiet man living alone in a small lake town, fixing antique furniture in a workshop that smells of varnish and old wood. The woman he saved has become a successful businesswoman, admired and respected, yet never quite at peace. When fate brings them together in a lakeside coffee shop, neither one recognizes the other, but a battered silver bracelet, carried by one and remembered by the other, is about to unravel a secret that has connected their lives for 2 decades. Ethan Carter was 42 years old, and most people in town believed they knew him, though almost none of them truly did. He had moved to the lake more than 15 years earlier, after his wife Sarah passed away from an illness that took her slowly. The way some storms take their time before they finally break. Since then, Ethan had built a life that asked very little of the world. He ran a small workshop near the edge of town, restoring antique chairs, cabinets, and clocks that other people had given up on. His hands were steady, his voice was calm, and his days followed a rhythm that rarely changed. Every morning, before the town fully woke, he rowed his old wooden boat out onto the lake, watching the mist lift slowly off the water like a curtain rising on an empty stage. People waved to him from the shore. Children liked him because he always had a kind word and sometimes a small wooden toy he had carved himself. Yet if anyone had been asked to describe who Ethan Carter truly was underneath all that quiet routine, they would have struggled to answer. He kept his sorrows private, the way some men keep old letters folded at the bottom of a drawer. His workshop sat at the end of a gravel lane lined with old maple trees, a converted barn with tall windows that let in long bars of afternoon light across the sawdust floor. Inside, half-finished pieces waited patiently for his attention. A rocking chair missing one spindle, a writing desk whose drawers no longer slid evenly, a grandfather clock whose pendulum had not swung in 3 decades until Ethan coaxed it gently back to life. He worked the way some men pray, slowly and without complaint, finding in the repetition of sanding and staining a kind of peace he had never managed to locate anywhere else. Customers brought him pieces from estates, from grandmother's attics, from houses being emptied after a death in the family, and Ethan treated each one with the same careful patience, understanding instinctively that what people were really paying him to restore was not the wood itself, but the memory attached to it. He rarely charged what the work was worth, and the few friends he had in town often teased him about it, though none of them pushed too hard, sensing correctly that Ethan gave generously because giving asked nothing difficult of him in return. In the evenings, after the workshop had gone quiet and the light outside had faded to violet, Ethan would sometimes sit on the porch of his cabin with a glass of something simple, listening to the frogs along the shoreline and the occasional call of a loon somewhere out on the dark water. Sarah's photograph still sat on the mantel inside, her smile preserved exactly as it had been the year before the illness took hold. And Ethan still spoke to her sometimes, quietly, the way people do when grief has softened into something closer to companionship than pain. He had loved her fully, and had grieved her fully. And in the years since, he had told himself that this was simply the shape his life would take from now on, steady and solitary, useful to others in small ways, without needing very much in return. It was not an unhappy life. It was simply a life lived carefully at arm's length from the rest of the world. A life that had not asked to be disturbed. In that same drawer, beneath a stack of folded receipts and faded photographs, Ethan kept 2 objects he had never shown to a single living soul. The first was a silver bracelet, bent slightly out of shape, its surface dulled by years of humidity and neglect. The second was a newspaper clipping, brittle and yellowed. The ink faded, but still legible enough to read the headline, "Young Woman Rescued from Submerged Car During Storm." There was no photograph of him in that article, no name, no mention of the man who had pulled the unconscious woman from the wreckage and disappeared before the ambulance arrived. He had wanted it that way. At 22 years old, Ethan had believed that a good deed needed no audience, no thanks, no consequence. He had walked away from the riverbank, soaked and shivering, carrying nothing but the bracelet that had slipped from her wrist in the chaos, and he had never gone looking for her. Over the years, the memory had softened at the edges, the way memories do. but it had never disappeared. Some nights, when the wind moved through the trees outside his cabin in a particular way, he would think of her, this stranger whose face he could still recall with surprising clarity, and wonder, quietly, almost without meaning to, whether she had lived a good life. Whether she even remembered that night at all. He would open the drawer, hold the bracelet in his palm, and ask the question that had followed him for 20 years. I wonder how she's doing now. Then he would close the drawer, put the kettle on, and let the moment pass. The way he let most things pass these days. Claire Bennett, by contrast, was a woman the world believed it understood completely. And that misunderstanding suited her most of the time. At 40 years old, she stood at the head of one of the most respected interior design firms in the country, a company she had built from almost nothing into a name that appeared regularly in business magazines and design journals. She wore tailored blazers the way other people wore comfort, moved through boardrooms with the calm authority of someone who had long ago stopped needing anyone's approval, and signed contracts worth more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Photographers loved her for the same reason journalists did. She was striking, articulate, and endlessly composed. Yet beneath the polished exterior that the cameras captured so easily, there existed a part of Claire that no magazine profile had ever managed to touch. She had never married. She had no children, no family of her own beyond a sister she rarely saw, and parents who had passed years earlier. Success had given her everything except the one thing she could never quite name. A persistent sense that something important was missing. Something she had been circling her entire adult life without ever landing on it. Therapists had asked her about it once or twice, in the handful of sessions she had allowed herself before deciding she preferred working through things alone. She always gave the same vague answer. I think I'm just tired. But tired was not quite the right word. And she knew it. Claire's offices occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building downtown. All clean lines and careful lighting, exactly the kind of space her clients expected from a woman who had built her reputation on transforming empty rooms into something that felt like belonging. Her assistants admired her. Her competitors respected her, sometimes against their own will. She traveled constantly, walking through half-finished penthouses and seaside estates, with the same calm precision she brought to everything, pointing out where a window should be widened, or where a fireplace needed to be moved 6 inches to the left. People often told her she had an instinct for making spaces feel like home, and she always smiled politely at the compliment, without ever quite admitting how strange it felt to be praised for creating warmth she so rarely experienced in her own life. Her apartment, ironically, was the one space she had never fully finished decorating. A handsome, but somehow unfinished collection of rooms that looked, to anyone who visited, like the home of someone perpetually about to move somewhere else. At night, when the city outside her windows had quieted into its long, glittering hum, Claire sometimes found herself standing at the glass, a glass of wine forgotten in her hand, wondering when exactly she had decided that being needed by everyone was an acceptable substitute for being known by someone. She had dated occasionally over the years, men who admired her ambition and were eventually unsettled by how little of herself she allowed them to see. She had told herself, after each of those endings, that she simply hadn't met the right person, that her standards were not unreasonable, that someday the right circumstance would present itself. But somewhere beneath that explanation lived a quieter, more honest one, that she had spent 20 years unconsciously measuring every man against a stranger she had known for only a few terrifying minutes in the rain, a stranger whose voice she could still hear clearly even though she could no longer remember exactly what he had said. Inside a small personal safe in her apartment, tucked behind business documents and a few pieces of jewelry she rarely wore, Claire kept a thin folder that told a story she had never shared with anyone close to her. Inside it was a photograph of a rescue truck pulled half off a flooded road, lights flashing against a curtain of rain. There was an old accident report, its language clinical and distant, describing a vehicle submerged in rising water and a young woman pulled to safety by an unidentified civilian, and there was a sketch, drawn by Claire herself many years ago. An amateur but careful rendering of a man's face, the only image she had of the person who had saved her life. She remembered fragments more than facts. The low, steady sound of his voice, telling her to stay calm. The strength of his hands as he pulled her through the broken window. The particular color of his eyes in the brief moment the emergency lights swept across his face before he disappeared into the dark and the rain. She had never learned his name. She had spent years, on and off, trying to find him, hiring people quietly to search old records, only to come up against the same wall every time. No name, no address, nothing but a story that existed more clearly in her memory than in any official document. Eventually, she had told herself it didn't matter anymore, that some debts simply went unpaid, and that she had built a good life regardless. But the folder remained in the safe, untouched, yet never discarded, the way some doors are closed, but never quite locked. It was a business opportunity, not memory or fate in any romantic sense, that finally brought Claire back to the small lake town where Ethan had spent the better part of 2 decades. Her firm had been approached about developing a luxury resort property along the lake shore. A quiet stretch of land, with old docks and older trees, the kind of place developers described as untouched, and locals described as home. Claire flew in to assess the site personally, as she always did for projects of significance, walking the property with a notebook in hand, mentally sketching where a spa might go, where the main building should face to catch the sunset. She had no idea, walking those quiet streets with her coffee in one hand and her tablet in the other, that the man she had spent 20 years failing to find was living less than a mile from where she stood. The town itself seemed to her pleasant but unremarkable, the kind of place she visited for work and left within the week. She checked into a small inn near the water, told her assistant she would need a few days, and set out the next morning to get a feel for the area the way she always did, on foot, with fresh eyes, looking for whatever story the land wanted to tell her. The coffee shop where they finally crossed paths sat at the corner of the town's only real intersection, a narrow brick building with large windows that let in the soft gray light of an overcast morning. Claire walked in, already distracted, scrolling through an email on her phone, her mind half on the resort proposal and half on a call she needed to return before noon. She reached the counter, ordered a black coffee, and turned too quickly, the cup slipping from her fingers before she had fully gripped it. A hand caught it before it hit the floor, steady and sure, spilling only a small splash onto the tile. That hand belonged to Ethan, who had been standing nearby waiting for his own order, dressed simply in a flannel shirt with sawdust still clinging faintly to his sleeve from the morning's work. He smiled, handed the cup back to her without making a production of it, and said something easy about how the floor in that shop had probably saved more coffee than it had ever spilled. Claire laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised her more than it surprised him, and thanked him. Neither one recognized the other. There was no flash of memory, no sudden recognition, nothing but 2 strangers sharing an ordinary, pleasant moment in an ordinary coffee shop on an ordinary morning. What followed that small collision was a conversation neither of them had planned to have. Ethan mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he didn't often see new faces in town, and Claire explained, in general terms, that she was there for work. They ended up at the same small table near the window, not entirely by design, simply because the shop was quiet and the morning was unhurried. Claire noticed, with some surprise, how easy it was to talk to him. She mentioned that she had grown up listening to her father's old classical records, and Ethan's face lit up in a way that made him look 10 years younger, admitting that he still played Chopin some evenings in his workshop while he worked, the music keeping him company in the quiet hours. They discovered they shared an appreciation for the lake itself, the particular stillness of early morning water, the way it seemed to hold its breath before the wind picked up. They also discovered, almost by accident, a shared dislike for pretension, for people who performed sincerity rather than simply living it. The rain outside had thinned to a soft drizzle by the time their coffee had gone lukewarm, and neither of them seemed particularly eager to notice. Ethan found himself talking more than he usually did with strangers, telling her about an old church pew he was restoring for a family 2 towns over, watching with quiet pleasure as she leaned forward, genuinely curious, asking questions that suggested she understood something about craftsmanship most people never bothered to notice. Claire, in turn, found herself describing a hotel lobby she had once redesigned entirely around a single beam of afternoon light, watching Ethan listen with the same unhurried attention he seemed to bring to everything, as though her words mattered enough to deserve his full presence. Neither of them performed for the other. There was no charm offensive, no calculated wit. Only the simple, almost forgotten pleasure of being heard by someone who wasn't waiting for their turn to speak. Claire found herself laughing more in 20 minutes than she had in months, a fact that startled her slightly once she noticed it. Ethan, for his part, felt an unfamiliar ease settle over him, the kind he hadn't experienced with anyone since long before his wife had died. As they prepared to part ways, Claire's eyes drifted briefly to his wrist, where a worn silver bracelet sat loosely against his skin. Something about it tugged faintly at her memory, a sensation she couldn't quite place, gone before she could examine it. She told herself it was nothing, said a polite goodbye, and walked back out into the gray morning light, unaware of how much that small, ordinary bracelet would come to matter. In the weeks that followed, the lake town proved smaller than either of them expected, and their paths crossed again and again, in ways that felt less like coincidence, and more like the town itself was conspiring on their behalf. Claire ran into Ethan at the old wooden dock, where he sometimes brought clients to discuss restoration projects for their lake houses, and again at the local bookstore, where she had gone looking for a guide on regional architecture, and found him browsing a shelf of woodworking manuals 2 aisles over. She saw him once more at the farmer's market on a Saturday morning, helping an elderly vendor carry crates of vegetables to her car without being asked, and again at the town's modest autumn fair, where he was teaching a group of children how to whittle small wooden boats. Each encounter added a new layer to the picture Claire was forming of him, a man who moved through the world with a quiet generosity that seemed to expect nothing in return. At the dock, he had shown her, almost shyly, a small sailboat he was restoring for a widower down the road, explaining each repair with the patient enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved the work rather than simply tolerating it for a paycheck. At the bookstore, they had ended up sitting on the floor of the narrow architecture aisle for nearly an hour, comparing notes on old lake houses, Claire sketching rough floor plans on the back of a receipt, while Ethan described which materials would actually survive the region's harsh winters. At the farmer's market, she had watched him from a distance for a full minute before he noticed her, struck by how naturally kindness seemed to move through him, how he never once glanced around to see if anyone was watching him help. And at the fair, surrounded by children clutching half-finished wooden boats, she had felt something unfamiliar tighten pleasantly in her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. For his part, Ethan found himself looking forward to these chance meetings more than he wanted to admit, rearranging small errands in his week in ways he told himself were practical but knew, somewhere beneath the surface, were not. He began timing his trips to the bookstore around the hours she had mentioned preferring. He started bringing 2 coffees instead of 1 on mornings, when he suspected she might be at the dock reviewing her notes. He told himself each time that these were small, harmless adjustments, the kind anyone might make for a pleasant new acquaintance, and each time he knew, quietly, that the explanation was thinner than it sounded. Neither of them moved quickly, and neither of them moved without hesitation. Claire had built an entire identity around independence, around the conviction that she did not need anyone's presence to feel complete, and the prospect of opening herself to someone again, especially someone whose life looked nothing like her own, unsettled her more than she expected. Ethan carried his own quiet doubts, the sense that a woman who flew between cities closing million-dollar deals could have little use for a man who spent his days sanding old chairs by lamplight in a workshop that smelled of linseed oil. He told himself their worlds simply didn't fit together, even as he found himself thinking about her more often than was reasonable for 2 people who had known each other only a few weeks. One evening, as the sun lowered itself slowly behind the tree line and painted the surface of the lake in shades of amber and rose, they sat together on the old dock near Ethan's cabin, their conversation drifting, as it often did, into quieter territory. Claire, watching the water without quite looking at him, said something she rarely said to anyone. "I was saved once, a long time ago, by someone I never got to thank properly." Ethan went still beside her, his breath catching somewhere in his chest, though he gave no outward sign beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. He said nothing. He let the silence stretch, the way a man does when he is not yet ready to know what he suspects might be true. It was Claire's work, ultimately, that began pulling at the thread neither of them had dared to touch. As part of her due diligence for the resort project, she visited the town's small historical archive, hoping to find records related to the property's previous ownership and any environmental history relevant to the land. While paging through old folders, she came across something unrelated to her actual task, an accident report from 20 years earlier describing a car swept off a flooded road during a severe storm, and a young woman pulled from the wreckage by an unnamed civilian rescuer. The name of the rescuer had never been recorded. The space on the form left permanently blank. Claire stared at that blank line for a long moment, feeling something stir uncomfortably in her chest, though she could not yet say exactly why this particular document, among so many others she had reviewed over the years, struck her so deeply. She made a copy of it before leaving, telling herself it was simply professional curiosity, knowing somewhere underneath that explanation that it was not. Around the same time, in his quiet cabin across town, Ethan opened the drawer where he kept his 2 private relics and found, to his quiet alarm, that the bracelet was missing. He searched the drawer thoroughly, then the rest of the room, lifting cushions and checking pockets with a kind of urgency that surprised even him, given how many years had passed since he had last truly thought about that bracelet as anything more than a private memory. He could not say why its absence troubled him so deeply, only that it did. The way losing something small can sometimes feel like losing something much larger. What he did not know, and could not have guessed, was that the bracelet had slipped from a loose fold in his jacket pocket weeks earlier during one of his chance encounters with Claire. Perhaps that very first morning in the coffee shop, when he had reached out to catch her falling cup, and had ended up, quietly, and without either of their notice, in the lining of her own coat. Claire herself had not yet discovered it. It sat there, forgotten. A small piece of silver carrying 20 years of unspoken history, waiting for the moment it would finally be found. That moment arrived on a quiet evening when Claire, preparing for a cooler night, reached into her coat pocket for gloves and instead felt something cold and unfamiliar brush against her fingers. She pulled out the bracelet and turned it over slowly in her palm, studying its bent shape, its dulled silver surface, feeling an inexplicable wave of familiarity wash over her, though she could not place where she had seen it before. A fragment of memory flickered at the edge of her mind, gone again before she could grasp it fully, like a word on the tip of the tongue that refuses to surface. She set the bracelet on her nightstand and stared at it for a long while that night, troubled by a feeling she had no name for, certain only that it mattered. Somehow, in a way, she could not yet explain. Driven now by a restlessness she didn't fully understand, Claire began to dig deeper into the old accident report she had found at the archive, treating it less like idle curiosity and more like an investigation she could not abandon. She tracked down a retired police officer who had worked the area during the years in question, an older man named Walter Higgins who remembered the storm clearly, describing it as one of the worst the region had seen in a decade. She found a former emergency responder, a woman named Patricia Doyle, who recalled arriving at the scene to find a young woman already pulled safely from the wreckage, conscious but in shock, with no sign of the person who had rescued her. Claire requested old hospital records from that period, learning little beyond what she already knew, that she herself had been the young woman in question, treated for minor injuries and released within a day, the identity of her rescuer never recorded anywhere in the official paperwork. Each new piece of information confirmed what she already understood, while adding nothing that brought her closer to a name. While Claire searched, Ethan found himself returning, almost against his will, to memories he had spent 2 decades trying not to dwell on too closely. He remembered the violence of the river that night, water moving with a force that seemed almost personal in its fury, the way the car's headlights had cut briefly through the rain before disappearing beneath the surface. He remembered diving in without fully deciding to, the cold shocking the air from his lungs, the desperate scramble to find the door handle by feel alone. He remembered the young woman's face, pale and still in the dim light, and the relief that had flooded through him when she finally coughed and opened her eyes on the muddy bank. He told himself, as he often had over the years, that none of it mattered anymore, that it was a closed chapter from another lifetime. But sitting in his workshop some evenings, the radio playing softly in the background, he knew that wasn't entirely true. Some things refuse to stay closed, no matter how firmly a person tries to shut the door. The thread connecting them tightened further when Claire, continuing her quiet investigation, spoke with an elderly woman named Margaret Tate, who had lived near the river for most of her life and remembered the storm vividly, including a young man who had moved to the area not long after. A man people said had once done something brave but never spoke of it. I remember that young man used to live near the lake, Margaret told her, her voice thoughtful and a little distant, as though pulling the memory up from somewhere deep. Claire felt something settle uneasily in her stomach at those words, a suspicion she wasn't yet ready to name, though it had already begun forming somewhere in the back of her mind, refusing to be ignored any longer. From that point forward, Claire found herself watching Ethan with a different kind of attention, noticing details she might once have overlooked. His age aligned with what the timeline suggested. He had lived near the lake for as long as anyone in town could remember, arriving not long after the period in question. The bracelet, now resting in a small box in her apartment, matched nothing she could prove definitively. Yet it nagged at her every time she looked at it. And one afternoon, while helping him carry firewood toward his workshop, she caught a brief glimpse of a faded scar along his shoulder as his shirt shifted. A mark that could have come from any number of accidents, but that struck her, in that instant, as significant. Still, she found herself unable to fully believe what every piece of evidence seemed to be quietly suggesting. The idea that the man she had spent 20 years searching for, on and off, in quiet moments of unresolved longing, might be the same man she had been sharing coffee and conversation with for weeks, felt almost too large, too coincidental, too much like something from a story rather than her own actual life. One evening, working up a courage she didn't fully understand, she asked him directly, her voice carefully casual, "Have you ever saved anyone?" Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes, before he offered a small, deflecting smile. "That's a very old story," he said, and changed the subject before she could press further, leaving her with more questions than she had started with. The storm that finally forced the truth into the open arrived without much warning, the way the worst ones often do, building from a gray afternoon sky into something far more dangerous by nightfall. Claire had been driving back from the resort site toward her inn when the rain intensified beyond anything the local forecasts had predicted, the road ahead disappearing into sheets of water that made visibility nearly impossible. She tried to navigate carefully, slowing as she approached a low stretch of road she hadn't realized had already begun flooding, the water rising faster than she could process. Her car lost traction suddenly, sliding sideways before coming to rest with two wheels submerged in rapidly rising water, the current pulling at the vehicle with a strength that made her stomach drop in recognition, though she had no conscious memory of the night 2 decades earlier that her body seemed to remember anyway. Panic rose in her chest as the water crept higher against the door, her hands fumbling uselessly against a window control that had stopped responding. Fragments of memory she didn't know, she still carried surfaced violently, the cold, the dark, the sense of being trapped, the same fear she had buried so deeply she had nearly convinced herself it belonged to someone else's story. Thunder rolled across the lake in long, low waves, and lightning lit the flooded road in brief, blinding flashes that made the rising water look almost silver. Claire pulled at the door handle again and again, her breath coming faster, her thoughts narrowing down to the simple animal fear of a body trapped somewhere it cannot survive. She thought, absurdly, of all the meetings still on her calendar, of the resort blueprints sitting unfinished on her desk, of how strange it was that a life so carefully built could end on a forgotten stretch of road in the space of a few terrible minutes. The water reached the bottom of the window, cold and relentless, and somewhere beneath the panic a smaller, older voice in her seemed to whisper that she had been here before, that her body already knew the shape of this fear, even if her mind had locked it away. Ethan, who had been driving home along that same stretch of road after checking on a client's property near the water, saw her headlights at an unnatural angle through the rain and didn't hesitate for even a moment. He pulled over, left his truck running with its hazard lights cutting through the downpour, and waded into the rising water, without a second thought, the same instinct that had carried him into a different flood 20 years earlier taking over completely. The current pulled hard against his legs, colder and stronger than he expected, but his body remembered this too, remembered the particular discipline of moving forward against water that wanted to take you somewhere else. He reached her car, pulled at the door until it gave way against the pressure of the water, and guided her out with steady hands, shouting over the wind for her to stay calm, to hold on to him, to trust that he had her. The scene unfolded almost exactly as it had 2 decades before, The storm, the water, the stranger pulling her toward safety. Except this time there was no anonymity left to protect, no darkness thick enough to hide what was about to be revealed. Claire clung to him as he half carried, half guided her toward the higher ground at the edge of the road, the rain hammering down around them, her legs barely cooperating beneath her, his arm locked firmly around her shoulders the entire way. In the chaos of the rescue, Ethan's jacket caught on the broken edge of the car door and tore along the shoulder seam, exposing for one unmistakable moment the old faded scar Claire had noticed days earlier, now fully visible in the gray afternoon light. She stared at it, soaked and shaking, every fragment of memory she had spent 20 years failing to assemble, suddenly locking into place with devastating clarity. The voice, the hands, the scar, all of it converging into a single, undeniable truth standing directly in front of her, breathing hard, rain running down his face, looking at her the way he had looked at her once before, in a night neither of them had ever fully let go. The days following the storm passed in a kind of suspended quiet for both of them, each aware that something had shifted but neither yet ready to speak the words that would make it permanent. Claire stayed in her room at the inn for 2 full days, replaying the rescue over and over, fitting each new memory into place like pieces of a puzzle she had been carrying unfinished for 20 years. She thought about the accident report, with its blank line, where a name should have been, about Margaret Tate's offhand comment, about the scar she had glimpsed days before it was ever fully revealed. Everything had been there all along, waiting patiently for her to notice. And now that she finally had, she found herself strangely afraid of what came next, afraid that saying it aloud might somehow make it less true, or worse, might change something between them that had only just begun to feel solid. Claire finally drove to Ethan's cabin on a clear afternoon. The storm long past, the lake calm again, as though nothing had happened at all. The gravel crunched softly beneath her tires as she pulled up the lane, and she sat in the car for a long moment before stepping out, gathering whatever courage she had left. She carried the silver bracelet in her hand, the same bent, dulled piece of silver that had traveled silently between their lives for 2 decades, and placed it gently on the small table near his door. Her eyes were already wet before she spoke. "Is it you?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Ethan said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the bracelet, on the woman standing before him, who had once been a stranger pulled from a sinking car, and was now someone whose presence had quietly reshaped his recent months. The afternoon light fell across the table between them, catching the dull silver and making it gleam faintly, as though even the bracelet understood the weight of the moment. Finally, he nodded, the gesture small but absolute, carrying the weight of everything he had never said to anyone in 20 years. Claire's composure broke completely in that instant, tears falling freely as 20 years of searching, of wondering, of carrying an unpaid debt of gratitude finally found their resolution in the small, quiet room. She had spent 2 decades imagining this moment in countless forms, rehearsing words of thanks she never thought she would have the chance to say. And now that the moment had arrived, she found herself unable to speak at all, overwhelmed instead by the simple, staggering fact that the man who had saved her life had been sitting across from her at coffee shop tables and lakeside docks for weeks, neither of them aware of the invisible thread connecting them all along. Ethan, watching her cry, felt something loosen in his own chest that had been tightly wound for 20 years. He crossed the small room and sat beside her, not touching her yet, simply present, the way he had learned to be present for people in difficult moments. He told her quietly that he had never wanted recognition, had never wanted repayment of any kind, had only ever hoped, in the years since that storm, that she had gone on to live a good life. He admitted, his voice low and unguarded in a way it rarely was, that he had thought of her more often than he had ever told anyone, that he had wondered about her on quiet evenings for 2 decades without ever expecting an answer. Seeing her now, successful and whole, sitting in his small cabin with tears on her face and gratitude in her voice, felt to him like an answer to a question he hadn't realized he was still asking. They sat together for a long while after that, saying very little, the silence between them no longer the careful silence of strangers but something warmer, something that had finally been given permission to exist. Claire picked up the bracelet once more, turning it over in her palm, and asked him gently why he had never come forward, why he had let 20 years pass without ever claiming what most people would have considered a simple, deserved thanks. Ethan considered the question for a moment, before answering honestly that he had never believed the moment needed an audience. That some kindnesses felt more complete when they asked for nothing in return. Claire studied him quietly, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the full shape of the man she had spent 2 decades unknowingly searching for. In the months that followed, Claire made a decision that surprised her business partners and delighted the people of the lake town in equal measure. Rather than proceeding with the luxury resort her firm had originally been hired to develop, she proposed something different entirely. A community center built on the same lakeside property, a space meant to serve the town rather than wealthy outside visitors, with public docks, a library, a workshop space for local craftspeople, and a meeting hall for the kind of gatherings that had once brought the town together before anyone had thought to commercialize the water itself. Her partners were skeptical at first, pointing out the difference in projected returns. But Claire found, for the first time in years, that she didn't particularly care what the spreadsheet said. Ethan, drawing on years of restoration experience, became deeply involved in the project, advising on materials, helping source reclaimed wood for the interior, spending long afternoons beside Claire, as the plans slowly took physical shape. They argued occasionally over small details, the placement of a window, the choice of flooring, and found, to their mutual surprise, that even their disagreements felt comfortable, the kind of friction that comes from two people who trust each other enough to disagree honestly. Their relationship deepened during those months, not through dramatic gestures but through the accumulation of ordinary moments, shared meals after long workdays, quiet evenings reviewing blueprints together, the particular comfort of being understood by someone who had, in the strangest possible way, already saved your life once before. Neither of them rushed what was happening between them. There was no urgency in it, no performance, only the slow, steady warmth of two people who had finally found their way to each other after 20 years of moving through the world, unaware of how closely their paths had once crossed. The community center opened on a clear evening in early autumn, the lake catching the last gold light of the setting sun, the kind of evening that seemed to have been arranged specifically for the occasion. The whole town gathered along the new docks and pathways, children running along the water's edge, neighbors greeting each other with the easy familiarity of a place that had finally gotten back something it had quietly been missing. Lanterns hung from the porch of the new building, their warm light reflecting in long, trembling lines across the surface of the water. And somewhere, a small group of musicians played something soft and unhurried, the kind of music that asked nothing of anyone, except to be present. Claire stood near the water with Ethan beside her, watching the soft light spread across the surface of the lake. The same lake that had once nearly taken her life, and had instead, through some strange and patient design, given her back something far greater than she had ever expected to find. She turned to him and said quietly, "It took me 20 years to find you." Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that came easily to him now in a way it hadn't in a very long time, and answered, "Good thing the rest of my life is still long enough." They walked together along the new dock as the evening deepened into a soft blue dusk, the lights of the community center glowing warmly behind them, the silver bracelet resting once again on Claire's wrist, no longer simply a relic of a night she had spent 2 decades trying to understand. It had become something else entirely now, a quiet promise between two people who had once been strangers connected only by a moment of fear and courage in a flooded river, and who had found, 20 years later, that the same thread which had once saved a life had patiently, quietly brought them home to each other.